Okay, so another issue, the Keystone XL pipeline. The Keystone XL pipeline. If you look at the little picture on the left here, you can see that they want to put a pipeline in from in Canada and goes down. This pipeline is designed to take oil from Canada, move it to the Gulf of Mexico, convert it into oil products, and sell it to China. Has no benefit to the United States, except maybe 50 jobs. 6,000 jobs during construction, but large parts of it, as you can see, are already constructed. 50 permanent jobs. Now, their argument for why this is good for the United States, the company that's putting this in, their argument of why this is good for the United States is it generates property taxes along its route. That's their argument about why we should do this in the United States, why the United States should put this pipeline there. This pipeline didn't do a proper environmental impact statement. And again, part of government regulation, and people complain, government red tape, government bureaucracy. To put this pipeline in, you have to do a big study that shows its environmental impact. It crosses the Missouri River twice. So you're going to have this 3-foot wide oil pipeline that twice is going through the Missouri River, which feeds water for 30 million people and thousands of farmers. If that pipeline bursts, it's going to be would be an environmental disaster of huge scale. So what goes into that environmental impact statement? The actual construction impact is probably low, though again, if you're a Native American, it's going right through your historic land. And in Nebraska, there are some people there are fighting it because of the path it takes. What's the right answer and the wrong answer? And again, I'm not telling you that I know the right answer or the wrong answer. I'm telling you that these things are always complex. There are arguments on both sides. So we have a bunch of labor laws. The Clayton Act we already talked about. The Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938 gives you minimum wage, gives you overtime if you work over 40 hours a week. The National Labor Relations Act allows for collective bargaining. It creates fair elections for you people who want to unionize. It has a lot of protections in it for labor. So this progressive era, we get all this labor legislation that's good for workers. Workers can't be sued. Unions can't be sued. We get minimum wage. We get maximum hours. We get fair elections. We get collective bargaining. So all during this period, we're getting things that are better for workers. That goes the other way starting in 1947. In 1947, we get the Taft-Hartley Act. The Taft-Hartley Act, for one thing, allows the President of the United States to force striking workers back to work. He can order them back to work. Tell them it's in the national interest, you must stop your strike, and they have to go back to work. It also says that you don't ever have to join a union before you get hired in a company. Before Taft-Hartley, there was something called a closed shop. And in a closed shop, you had to join the union first, and then you could get hired. So if you're going to go work for Ford, you had to join the United Auto Workers first, and then you could get hired by Ford. Since Taft-Hartley, and again, some people say this is good for workers, but again, I don't know, depends on which worker you are, right, whether you think that or not. Under Taft-Hartley, you can get the job first and then join the union, and your state can pass a law called a right-to-work law, which Nevada has, 9 states have, that says you never have to join the union. So let's go back for a second, just because I'm all messed up here and I mistimed this. It's important to understand, besides the fact that we have all these labor laws, and then more recent labor laws after Taft-Hartley have been, again, less pro-worker and more pro-business. All of these laws apply to workers and companies engaged in interstate commerce, and you shouldn't forget that the Commerce Clause empowers this, and all of this is about interstate commerce. Okay, so we have the FDA. They do food inspections. You can thank Teddy Roosevelt for that, though some people argue that the big food producing companies actually wanted the inspections because it makes production cost more, and they thought it would drive small companies out of business, that small companies wouldn't be able to afford the inspections, and the little guys would get driven out of existence by the government. Can you have rat droppings in your cereal? And the answer to that question is yes. The government food inspection isn't to make sure your cereal has no rat droppings. It's to make sure it's safe to eat. So there's some rat droppings in your Cheerios, probably. Drugs, same thing. Not rat droppings. But there's a very long approval process. That approval process historically is way too long in the United States, way longer than in other countries. And it's not very good. They've approved drugs that don't work. Many times the FDA has approved drugs that don't work. Or they've approved drugs that have horrible side effects that they didn't do. If you only allow someone to test drugs, a company to test its drugs on male prisoners in a prison, you're going to miss people. You're going to miss old people. You're going to miss women. You're going to miss pregnant women. You're going to miss babies. All of these potential side effects that are out there, you're just going to miss them. So people have talked for years about changing the approval process for the drug industry because it doesn't work very well, either for the drug companies or for us, the consumer. We want safe drugs, and it's not clear that we're getting safe and effective drugs out of the process that the FDA uses. So, Trump stuff, I'll give you a quick example. The financial crisis, we saw the 3 deregulation laws. The law to fix those was this law Dodd-Frank, which again was written heavily by people in the financial industry, and mostly it sucked, but it's there. It's at least some protection for us. The Trump administration has changed it, so instead of applying for banks above $50 billion, it applies to banks above $250 billion. So, for example, American Express is no longer covered by Dodd-Frank and doesn't have to follow its rules because it's somewhere in between a $50 billion company and a $250 billion company. He's famous now for deregulation, but he's also regulated. For example, he made it harder for U.S. companies to invest in foreign biotech companies and to hire foreign workers. And again, certainly that's within the kind of thing you would think that he would do in his plan, but it's not just about cutting regulations. You can see from this chart that in 2017, this chart shows you how many new rules are created each year. And you can see that most former presidents are creating 200 to 300 rules a year, going back into the 90s. And Trump created about 60 new rules in 2017. That number went up in 2018. So his first 2 years, pretty good there in terms of new rules if you're against new rules. So some things that are on his list. And you can, you're going to have a link when you go look to go see some of this stuff. He's made it easier to incinerate waste, easier to license a private spaceship, like we've seen all the private spacecraft companies come out, easier to operate drones when they fly over people. Everybody was concerned about drones, spying on people and that kind of stuff. But he eased the drone rules, and he made it easier for farmers to tap into rural natural gas lines to use on their farm. Made it harder to gain asylum if you're from outside the United States. And, again, something we just talked about, he made it harder to include human exposure to mercury in an environmental impact study. So when we're doing an environmental impact study of coal industry now, say building a new coal-fired power plant, the fact that that coal plant is dumping mercury into the atmosphere can no longer be put into the environmental impact study on that coal-fired power plant. And then just straight up things that are gone. He removed net neutrality, but that's held up in the courts, and Congress might try to override him. We'll see. He took away protections to people who borrow from payday loan companies and for student loan borrowers. He eased the fuel economy rules so that cars we're getting more and more on average. Cars had to get more fuel economy, better fuel economy every year and produce less pollution. He eased that rule, so they no longer have to do that. He eased the restrictions on emissions from coal-fired power plants. He changed the Title IX protections on sexual harassment at the university, so you don't just have to prove you were sexually harassed, you have to prove that it somehow materially affected your education before you can go after the university. And it shrinks the number of bodies of water that are considered federal, which means the federal waters of the United States rules, the laws that apply to conservation of federal waterways, now applies to fewer rivers, and that opens up more areas for oil drilling in particular by changing the area that those can be in. We also saw him in Utah. He shrunk the size of a national monument, and that opens up land in Utah for oil drilling and mining as well. That was previously federal land that could not be drilled on or oiled on. So again, some people look at that and they go, hey, that's a great list. He's really great. He did all this great stuff. Other people look at this and go, no, I don't want him drilling. I want mercury considered. I want Title IX. I want coal-powered plants to not be polluting. So, good, bad, right? You get to read the list and you get to decide. And I just stuck this guy up here to remind you one last time that all of these things are interconnected. Every time we put more rules and regulations on, it's probably going to cost a job or cost somebody some income or cost some business or revenue. There's a cost. And every time we put that rule on, there's a benefit. Somebody's better off. We still have bald eagles, or we are putting less pollution into the air, or there's less mercury in our tuna. All of these things are interconnected and complicated, and we need to remember that.